Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Pope Francis, who is a Jesuit by training, recently told some Jesuits a bunch of stuff that sounds borderline heretical, if not completely heretical, according to the teachings of Pope Pius X and Pope Pius XII, St. Pius X and Venerable Pope Pius XII. In the interview, which was classic of a Pope Francis interview, some of it is totally fine, and some of it was completely not so fine. Essentially, he told this group of Jesuits that they have to be okay with radical inclusivity, doctrinal evolution, and that synodality must be restored and is crucial to the life of the Church. This brings up a major concern with the heresy of modernism. If you're not sure what modernism is a heresy which, seeking to reconcile the Catholic faith with key tenets of modern philosophy, notably agnosticism, subjectivism, and progressivism, reduces the faith to subjective religious experience and dogmatic truths to mere symbols or metaphors, which, to remain alive, must continually evolve. This is a definition that was put together by Father William McGilvray, who I just interviewed on my channel. We talked about modernism at length. I suggest you go check that out if you want to see a really in-depth combing over the text of Pope Pius X Pascendi about the heresy of modernism. And we go through it sort of, way more in depth than we will here for almost 2 hours. But what Pope Francis was saying in this interview was not simply Neomodernism, which we'll talk about as well. It really was modernism par excellence without even being hidden at all. And we're going to go over why that is. And we're going to think about perhaps what some of the objections might be from those who might say we're saying things we shouldn't say, we're pointing out things that we shouldn't be pointing out, and really Pope Francis isn't actually espousing some sort of modernism, and we'll go over some of that. But in any case, so here in this article, we see here, excuse me, it's from the Vatican News website. So please, ladies and gentlemen, the translation is from the Vatican herself. I don't think that we can say that this was a mistranslation by some radtrad. And it's called Pope tells Jesuits inclusivity, doctrinal evolution. That is the kicker right there. Doctrinal evolution. Synodality are crucial to the Church. Synodality is pretty bad, although I don't know if we really say maybe it's modernist. Actually, it kind of is in a sense, but doctrinal evolution is really, really modernist. So let's just kind of go through this. And it was in an open dialogue with the Jesuits of Lisbon during his visit to Portugal for World Youth Day. I'll make this a little bit bigger here. Here we go. Pope Francis had this conversation. Inclusivity takes center stage. Central to the discussion was the theme of inclusivity. Throughout the World Youth Day in Lisbon, the rallying cry for an all-embracing church resonated powerfully with the words todos, todos, everyone, everyone. This is like love is love. These liberals love these stupid sayings. Pronounced by Pope Francis as he stressed that the church has space for everyone. Again, this is true. The Church does have space for everyone insofar as everyone is open to become Catholic, but it doesn't have space for everyone's behavior. Let's put it that way. He emphasized the pivotal importance of creating a space for all individuals, irrespective of their sexual orientation or gender identity within the Church. This message continued to echo through his exchange with the Jesuits of Portugal. Acceptance for all. The Pope reiterated his call to embrace homosexual people within the Church. He critiqued the disproportionate fixation on sexual transgressions, noting that other offenses often remain overlooked. This is a false dichotomy that Pope Francis is this is very much a false dichotomy. Excuse me. The idea that, you focus too much on that. Well, even if one were to focus more on a certain aspect of morality than another, it still wouldn't mean that aspect of morality shouldn't be focused on as much as it is. It would just mean that other aspects should be focused on as well. So, for example, if somebody is concerned with their health and they focus on getting exercise, well, let's just say they're exercising a lot, but they're still drinking like a fish. Okay, well, you shouldn't say, I don't like how you exercise so much, but you don't worry about your drinking. It's like, no, keep exercising that much if it's a good amount, and then also stop drinking. There's a difference here. The Pope reiterated his call to embrace homosexual people. Like I said, he emphasized the need for a pastorally sensitive and imaginative approach to accompanying individuals on their spiritual journeys. These things mean nothing, by the way. Imaginative, sensitive, and imaginative. Okay, so I guess it doesn't exist. It's an imagination. The Pope also recounted an encounter with a group of transgender individuals who were moved to tears by Pope Francis's acceptance and empathy. He underscored the necessity of reaching out to marginalized communities who often grapple with feelings of rejection, and he accentuated the significance of empathy and compassion. With respect to Pope Francis, sorry if you can hear my children above me there. Yeah, I mean, wherever a person is, you don't not engage with it. I mean, Pope Francis is a priest. He's a bishop. His job is to save souls. So, of course, you don't, refuse to be a pastor to any soul. So I personally don't have an issue with that. But the danger is obviously a sort of false sense of mercy where because you're accepted by Pope Francis the man, meaning he's very fatherly, which is good. That's a good thing. I'm not criticizing the Pope for this. It's a good thing to be fatherly to people. There's another level of, does this mean that the Pope, as a representative of the church, is signifying that the church is okay with the transgender ideology and agenda? Because that's not possible. And it's very interesting. The optics of it are very interesting. Like, for example, if the Pope, in a spontaneous act of charity, for example, in Rome, there are areas around the Colosseum and other places where prostitutes often hang out. If you've ever been to Rome, you've probably seen them. It's kind of one of the spectacles of that city. And perhaps if the Pope were to go out and just sort of surprise this group of prostitutes and bring them rosaries and ask if he can read the gospel to them or something, no one would say the Pope is being okay with prostitution. I don't think anyone would say that. But with this LGBT stuff, they'll say, well, look, the Pope is being okay with it. It just kind of shows you the politics behind it, which is why the optics of it are so important. And the Pope is a politician, and he should know that, and I'm sure he does. Okay. Urgent concerns regarding ongoing wars. In fairness to Pope Francis, he's been quite good on the Ukraine-Russia war. I don't think he's really taken sides, and he's basically saying just stop the fighting. And so thank you to the Pope for that. Okay, this is the part that's most important. Doctrinal development. So the dialogue delved into tensions existing within the Church, including reactionary attitudes and resistance to the tenets of the Second Vatican Council. Right away, this article is misleading because the Church herself has said that certain parts of the Second Vatican Council aren't even binding. So you couldn't have tension if you resisted something that's not binding. But anyway, the pontiff acknowledged the intricate challenges posed by those who scrutinize Vatican II without explicitly naming it. Well, we know this isn't at the SSPX because the SSPX explicitly names it. He underscored the dynamic nature of doctrinal evolution. That's the money phrase right there. And expounded on the notion that church doctrine is not an unchanging monolith, but rather an evolving entity. This, my friends, is modernism par excellence. And the examples here show you. He invoked historical instances such as the changing perspective on the death penalty, nuclear weapons, and slavery to illustrate the fluidity of doctrine over time. Okay, let's just break this down for a second here. The word doctrine, what does the word doctrine mean? Well, the word doctrine is a synonym for the word dogma, is a synonym for the word teaching, is a synonym for the word creed, according to the dictionary and the thesaurus. Of course, when we think of the dogmas of the Catholic Church, generally speaking, when people hear the word dogma, they think of something that's binding and unchanging. But really, the word dogma is another word for teaching. So you could say the church has infallible doctrines. You could also say the church has infallible dogmas. Historically, there are doctrines in the church that have been altered or in a sense changed. Certain things that are, and I'm being very delicate here because I don't want this to seem like I'm putting up a straw man, because the person who would have criticisms of what I'm saying will pull up, will basically attack it as a straw man if it is one. So, but as far as things that are held as, I'll give you an example. Often you've been told that Judas received Holy Communion at the Last Supper. And that is something that can be held or cannot be held. And some people have taught it and some people haven't taught it. And just to show you that I'm not making that up, I'm going to just look up here quickly on Tim Flanders' website. He has something on the theological notes. This is from Ludwig Ott's Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma, which is a seminal work. And you see the different levels of dogma here. Oops. Tim, I'm not going to subscribe to your website, all right? I text you all the time. So we have the levels. We have de fide, of the faith, explicit in scripture tradition, explicitly defined by highest church authority. So example, all who die in mortal sin will suffer hell for eternity. Denial of these truths is the mortal sin of heresy. De fide ecclesiastica, explicitly defined by church authority, implicit in scripture and tradition. For example, Assumption of Mary. And denial of these truths is the mortal sin of heresy. Sententias fide proxima, proximate to the faith, teaching is generally understood by the theologians as explicit in scripture and tradition, but not explicitly defined by the church. Example, the Blessed Trinity can only be known through revelation. Number 2, denial of any of these truths is the mortal sin of error, approximate to heresy. Sententia certa, theologically certain, implicit in scripture and tradition, not explicitly defined by the church. For example, the primary purpose of matrimony is a generation of children. The secondary purpose is mutual help and regulation of lust. Denial of any of these truths is the mortal sin of error against the faith. Sententia communes, number 5, common teaching that is implicit in tradition and is generally accepted by theologians. Number 1, willful sins against the sixth commandment are always mortal sins. This is generally held, but not explicitly. Number 2, it is licit to object to these teachings if and only if there is good reason. To object to any without reason is the mortal sin of temerity. And then here you go. Sententia probabilis, probable teaching, a teaching that is well founded on good authority that is open to question. Pious beliefs and tolerated opinions also fall under this note and have the lowest degree of certainty. For example, Judas received Holy Communion at the Last Supper. Denial of any of these teachings is licit, provided piety is given to legitimate authority. So really the top 4, I mean, there's no way around them. There's really no way around them. Number 5, very rarely. Number 6 can be debated. So with Pope Francis is saying something like there is an evolution or a change in Catholic dogma, really this can only be with sententia probabilis, with things that are not even really teachings, but are just kind of pious opinions that are held. Now, Pope Francis may personally believe that, but clearly his statements do not give that impression. His statements give the impression of a major heresy, which we're going to look at now. And this is from, where is it? Pope Pius X's encyclical. And here he talks specifically about, this is Pascendi, and he talks explicitly about one of the main tenets of the modernists. And he says, dogma is not only able, but ought to evolve and to be changed. This is strongly affirmed. This is strongly affirmed by the modernists. So he's saying that dogma evolves is strongly affirmed by the modernists. What is Pope Francis saying? He underscored the dynamic nature of doctrinal evolution and expounded on the notion that church doctrine is not an unchanging monolith, but rather an evolving entity. That sounds like a strong affirmation, underscoring the dynamic nature of doctrinal evolution and reiterated, an evolving entity, okay? And clearly flows from their principles. For among the chief points of their teaching is the following, which they deduce from the principle of vital immanence. Again, I talk about this in depth in my other interview on modernism with Father McGilvery. I recommend you go watch that. Namely, that religious formulas, if they are to be really religious and not merely intellectual speculations, ought to be living and to live the life of the religious sense. This is not to be understood to mean that these formulas, especially if merely imaginative, were to be invented for the religious sense. The origin matters nothing, any more than the number or quality. What is necessary is that the religious sense, with some modification when needful, should vitally assimilate them. In other words, it is necessary that the primitive formula be accepted and sanctioned by the heart. And similarly, their subsequent work from which are brought forth the secondary formulas must proceed under the guidance of the heart. Hence it comes that these formulas, in order to be living, should be and should remain adapted to the faith and him who believes. And he says, and it says here, if for any reason this adaptation should cease to exist, they lose their first meaning and accordingly need to be changed. So basically what this means is the modernists strongly affirm that the doctrine of evolution is a thing, that doctrine must evolve. It stems from a place of vital immanence, which is about your religious sense. So basically your experience of religion, the doctrines must match your experience of religion, essentially. And they must be modified when needed. And this is what the Pope is saying here, that church doctrine is an evolving entity. And he invoked historical instances, such as the changing perspectives on the death penalty. The death penalty never changed. That's not true. Nuclear weapons, that's not a good example because nuclear weapons aren't even that old, so it was never established as a teaching. And slavery. The church never changed her teaching on slavery. There have been historical approaches and policies by popes on what to do about slavery in certain places, but that certain types of servitude, because there are different levels of slavery, are permissible in the scriptures is clear. And this has nothing to do with anyone's race or whatever. It just has to do with sociological circumstances and what is revealed in Scripture. So this is what Pope Francis is saying is modernism. Whether he is a modernist or not, I can't say that. I'm not the Pope. Whether in his mind he believes something a little bit different, and if pressed on it, he might say, oh, I only mean that certain non-binding teachings can be adapted for certain circumstances, kind of like that sixth level of dogma. Okay, possibly. But the fact that he gives the example of the death penalty teaching has never changed. The Catechism of the Catholic Church has said that basically in our time, the death penalty is inadmissible. That doesn't mean it's immoral, and it doesn't mean it's impossible, and it doesn't mean that it's heretical, or doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that, in the opinion of the Pope, the death penalty is not for our time, which really is a modernist perception, the idea that you would change the doctrines with time. Okay, and then there's one more thing here I want to show you from Pope Pius XII. This is really about Neomodernism, which is how modernism is expressed more in our time. He says, moreover, they assert that when Catholic doctrine has been reduced to this condition, a way will be found to satisfy modern needs. Okay? And it's talking about, from the paragraph before, the assimilation of Catholic dogma with the tenets of dissidence, so with people who are heretics, basically. A way will be found to satisfy modern needs that will permit of dogma being expressed also by the concepts of modern philosophy, whether of immanentism or idealism or existentialism or any other system. Some more audacious affirm that his can and must be done, because they hold that the mysteries of faith are never expressed by truly adequate concepts, but only by approximate and ever-changeable notions. This is the evolution of doctrine, in which the truth is to some extent expressed, but is necessarily distorted. Wherefore they do not consider it absurd, but altogether necessary, that theology should substitute new concepts in place of the old ones, in keeping with the various philosophies in which the course of time it uses as its instruments, so that it should give human expression to divine truths in various ways, which are even somewhat opposed, but still equivalent, as they say. So basically, contradictory things can be true. They add that the history of dogmas consists in the reporting of the various forms in which revealed truth has been clothed, forms that have succeeded one another in accordance with different teachings and opinions that have arisen over the course of centuries. Fancy way of saying the modernists of our day, the modernists of our day are Neomodernists. This is Pope Pius XII writing in the 1950s. So they don't. Well, funny thing is Pope Francis is being explicit. I mean, he's being completely explicit that doctrine must change. One more line here, if I can show you. Before this chapter 13 or paragraph 13, he says, "The way is open to the intrinsic evolution of dogma." Goodness gracious. I mean, this is exactly what Pope Francis is saying. He says, "Here we have an immense structure of sophisms," which is basically like, intellectual trickery, which ruin and wreck all religion. So modernism ruins and wrecks all religion. And I don't know how we reconcile Pope Francis' saying, where he says, the dynamic nature of doctrinal evolution is underscored that doctrine is not an unchanging monolith, but rather an evolving entity. I don't know how we reconcile the teachings of Pope Pius X with Pope Francis. Just being honest. I know the problem with this conversation too, and I'm actually writing a book right now where I'll explore some of these topics. It won't be out for at least a couple months, but one of the problems you're going to see with some internet commentators and sort of Catholic apologist types talking about this, Catholic formation at virtually every Catholic university, except for a few, and it's probably present in all of them, although some of them offer at least some good traditional courses. But basically, everyone's a modernist. I was a modernist till like 4 years ago, because you can't help but be a modernist. So someone's going to look at what Pope Francis is saying here, this idea of doctrinal evolution, and they're going to find a way to explain it away, because they themselves are they have imbibed the same spirit of the evolution of doctrine, even if they define it or express it in a way that for them is satisfying and makes them feel orthodox. That's the problem. It's kind of like my friend Lloyd, who I've had on this show a few times. He says about Muslims, they have the same dictionary but different vocabulary. Or same vocabulary, different dictionary. So you can say things like, if a modernist can say something like, I do not believe in the evolution of dogma. But they define dogma as such, as something that isn't fixed for all time. So they're not really lying when they say they don't believe in the evolution of dogma. They believe that dogma is evolutionary, if that makes sense. It's very difficult. It's the most damnable and serpentine heresy in the history of the church. Part of this book that I'm writing, I was looking into Arianism, and I'm writing a portion on Arianism. Arianism was bad, but Arianism was obvious. It was clear what the Arians believed. They concerned themselves with very specific vocabulary, for example. Whereas with the modernist, the more ambiguous, the better. The neo-modernist especially. The neo-modernist is worse than the modernist. And this was interesting because this is going to upset some people, but Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II, many of the things that they said were neo-modernist. They were. And the thing about neo-modernism is you can't actually, when someone expresses something neo-modernist, it's basically impossible to pin them down as a modernist because they always leave themselves sort of an escape hatch because the phrase is ambiguous and could be interpreted in multiple ways. A modernist is not ambiguous. Pope Francis is not being ambiguous here when he says the evolution of dogma is vital to the church, essentially. That's not ambiguous. But if you look through the writings of Cardinal Ratzinger, especially before he was Pope, and John Paul II many times while he was Pope, you'll find very neo-modernist statements where a traditionalist can say, look, this is a problem. A neo-Catholic conservative can look at it and say, well, it could be interpreted as Orthodox. It's a big problem. It's the worst heresy we've ever had in the church, neo-modernism. Neo-modernism is worse than modernism, I think. Anyway, I'm just rambling at this point. So pray for Pope Francis. Read Pope Pius X's Lamentabili, which is his syllabus of errors. Read Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which is his encyclical against modernism. Read Pius XII Humani Generis, especially if you're one of those Catholics who likes to cite paragraph 36 of Humani Generis to say it supports evolution as in biological evolution, because the document does not support that. And you'll know that if you read the whole thing rather than just one sentence. And they're very difficult to read because these encyclicals were written for bishops. This is the thing. For example, if you look, if I just bring it up again here, he's talking about venerable brethren, health, and the apostolic blessing. He's writing to his colleagues. Okay, he's writing to bishops, and he talks about this in. He talks about this in the document where he says, your young clerics and the directors of your seminary. So anyway, he's talking to bishops here. So you got to understand, a bishop in 1907, the church was not in the state that it's in today. There were some modernists who were bishops, for sure. But these men had an insanely rigorous classical education. They could read and write in Latin and Greek and all this kind of stuff, and they were theologically sound. So he can write in this way to these giants of intellect who were these Catholic bishops, and they can understand it. So we try to read, it's very difficult. So you got to go through this document multiple times, and you've got to use a dictionary and the Catholic Encyclopedia when you're doing it. And if that's too difficult, you can listen to my show with Father McGilvery on my channel about modernism. So in any case, as always, ladies and gentlemen, let me know what you think in the comments. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.